Hello, my name's Mike Talty. I work for Microsoft in the UK, and this is one of a number of short tutorials on the ActiveTouch site about Silverlight 4, which is Microsoft's rich internet application technology. This is not the first video that I put on the site, so if you're looking for something that's a bit more of an overview, there is a video at http, I think I put it at bit.ly/ActiveTouch intro. So if you look there, you can find more of a comprehensive kind of overview kind of video. In this video, what I want to do is talk a little bit about layout in Silverlight 4. So we'll talk a little bit about layout for Silverlight 4. And to follow along, there's a few things you'd need. I'm using Visual Studio 2010. You could get the Express edition, which is the free edition, and you can get that from http bit.ly/VSWebExpress. I'm also using the Silverlight 4 tools for Visual Studio 2010. And you can get those from http bit.ly/Silverlight 4 tools. And I'll also use a little bit of Expression Blend perhaps as well, and you can get Expression Blend as a free trial version that you can get from http www.microsoft.com/expression, and if you follow the links through there, you'll find a version that you can download and install. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about layout in Silverlight 4. Let me just shut down Notepad here and run up Visual Studio. Now, we could talk about layout in Visual Studio, we could talk about layout in Expression Blend. Ultimately, it all comes down to the same thing. And there are lots of different properties you're going to see that affect the layout of your applications when you're dealing with Silverlight. Let me just create a new project in here while we're talking. So, as I'm just creating a simple Silverlight application here just so we can play with some things, the sorts of properties you're going to see, creating a website in the background, are properties like... Oops, wrong editor, Notepad. Are properties like width, height, margin, padding, horizontal alignment, vertical alignment. Some other ones you'll see will be things like text alignment, and some other things like, let's just have a think, horizontal content alignment and horizontal vertical alignment. Sorry, vertical content alignment is what I mean. So there's lots of different properties that you can set on content in order to affect how it's laid out on the screen in Silverlight. The other thing to think about as well is the different panels that we have in Silverlight. There's three built in. There's the grid, there's the canvas, and there's the stack panel. But there are other custom panels that you can get, or you can even build them yourself if you want to. So let's take a little look at this. Let me just shut down Notepad again and pop over to Visual Studio. And I'll just full screen Visual Studio so you can see it a little bit better, and I'll just lay it out so that the designer appears and that it is at the top rather than at the bottom. So we've got the design view at the top and we've got some XAML down here at the bottom. And what we've got on the screen at the moment is a blank user control with a grid in it. Grid is one of our panels that we can use. And let's make this simple in the first instance. Let's just set the background of that grid to red so that you can see it. And let's put a rectangle onto that grid. We could drag and drop it from the toolbox. In fact, let's go and do that. We'll drag and drop a rectangle from the toolbox. And just for the moment, I'm going to reset its layout so that we start with something simple. We don't need to name our rectangle, and we don't need to be very clear about its stroke. So we have a rectangle. Let it set its fill to green so that we can see it. And you'll notice the first thing about this, that the rectangle has entirely filled the grid. So by default in this situation, that's what's going to happen. It's going to take up all the available space that we give it. It consumes space. It's kind of hungry for space. Now, we can get it to consume less space by specifying a margin around it. So what we could do is we could type a margin, or we could go to the properties window and set it there. We could set a margin of, say, 24. That's 24 pixels at assuming 96 dpi. So it's around about 1/4 of an inch we think we've just specified as a margin on that thing. And you can clearly see the background coming through around that margin. We can also specify individual left, right, top, bottom margins. So this would be the margin on the left hand side, this would be the margin on the top, this would be the margin on the right hand side, this would be the margin on the bottom. So you can see how those margins have kind of been applied. So you've got left, top, right, bottom as those things are applied. So you can specify margins all the way around the element. We can also specify absolute widths and heights for our rectangle. So we can, for instance, specify that it has a width of, say, 96, which is kind of an inch. And you'll notice that if we do that, let's specify a height for it as well. Let's go ahead and say 96 again. So we've made it into a little square. And when we're specifying width and height, it now becomes kind of relevant as to where it aligns itself within its parent container. where it goes within the grid. And that is controlled by a couple of properties. We have horizontal alignment, which can be left, center, right and stretch. So let's say left on that, it hops over there. We could say right and it'll hop over there. And obviously we can set vertical alignments as well, which could be top or it could be bottom. It's going to make it disappear off the screen. Or we can make it center, or we can make it stretch. But stretch doesn't really apply if we've specified an absolute height on it, but will apply if we take that height away and it starts to stretch itself again. And as you might have guessed, stretch is the default, which is why when we first had our rectangle with no sizes specified on it, it was stretching to fill all of the area that was there. We also have a notion of maximum and minimum heights. This is really for content that dynamically is expanding. So this rectangle here is going to end up being quite big, but we could specify a maximum height on it. So if you said maximum height, let's say of 128, you'll notice now it has constrained itself, and we say maximum width of 128. And because we've asked it to stretch but not stretch too far, the rectangle is now doing its best to obey our constraints. So this is really for dynamic layout, where you want to say, look, I need this rectangle to be as big as the space allows, but not too big, that kind of idea. You sort of constrain it a little bit by specifying maxima that way. And just to make the point again that I am typing these sort of quickly into this XAML editor, you can always go over to your properties here and set maximum width and height and so on. It's just the same thing. You set that to 96. It's just the same as kind of typing it in. You can go either way with that. It's just, for me, a little bit quicker to do this than keep navigating across to this properties window. And of course the other way you can do it is just by selecting it on the design surface and dragging it around, and there you are setting in this case you're going to be setting margins on that rectangle, as you can see, and you're going to be setting, in this case we're not setting widths and heights, we're setting margins around it. That's what the editor's doing for us. But if we were to go and just change this, you can see that having clicked on those guys, we're now setting widths and heights as we drag it around. So we're actually manipulating the widths and heights there instead of manipulating the margins. So we can do both of those things within the designer. There's nothing kind of magic that we get by typing things in. It's all completely doable. And let me just put my rectangle back to its default. Now, a property that feels a lot like margin is another one called padding. And where padding kind of comes into play is in a slightly different situation. One of the unusual things about the controls in Silverlight is that often they allow for arbitrary content to be placed inside of them. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we take something like this button, and let's say content equals click, and we'll just go and define ourselves a button inside of the grid, and you can see there's our button defined inside of the grid. The interesting thing about this is that the content doesn't have to just be a piece of text like this. It can really be any arbitrary object. And so what we could do is take our button, and inside of that button we could put our rectangle. There's nothing wrong with that. Fill equals green, and let's just put that inside of the button. Now you might be wondering at that point, well, where's the rectangle gone? Well, there's something interesting kind of going on here. There's a few things coming into play. If we give the rectangle a width and height again, let's just say 96 and let's say height 96, then it shows up. And so obviously the rectangle is inside of the button. It is being displayed as content by the button. But by default, the button is not really stretching the rectangle. But if we give it an explicit width, then it does actually show up. We could get the button to stretch the rectangle. You might be thinking that the answer is horizontal alignment equals stretch and vertical alignment equals stretch. But this won't get you anywhere. And the reason for that is the button as a parent is kind of affecting how it displays the content. The button is a content control in this case, and it has an effect on how this is displayed. The parent here has a property called horizontal content alignment, i.e. how I display my content. And it has another one called vertical content alignment. And if you set those two things to stretch, you notice that the content is now there. So that's quite an important one. If you're putting content inside of controls like buttons and so on, and other controls support this notion, you need to know how is the content being aligned by the parent. And in this case, the button does not stretch its content by default, so we had to tell it to stretch. Now, when a control like this is displaying content, we can still have margins, of course. Let's say margin equals 24 all the way around, and there's the margin around the content. But there's also a notion on the parent of padding. So we could add padding here. Let's say on the left-hand side we'll have padding of 12, 24, 36, 48. And really what that's doing is it's constraining the space available to the child content. So this is kind of the button's padding before it even displays the content, and then the content is also applying a fixed margin as well. So padding belongs to the parent and margin kind of belongs to the child, and that's how those two things relate. So padding is also something you'll see. To be honest, you'll see it less frequently than something like margin, but it's also there, something that you can set when you are displaying content like this, and these two properties come into play as well. Of course, we can move these things once again to be, left or something like that, and because we have no explicit width, that would disappear at that point, but then we can put it back to stretching and it pops back in. If we stopped talking about buttons for a moment, let's get rid of this button and let's replace it with a text block, which we can go and drag from the toolbox. We get the text block, drag it out onto the design surface. Let me reset its layout again with the right mouse menu. Let's just reset all that, and it doesn't actually need a name. And so let's just say this is some text. Then one thing to be aware of with the text block is that just like the other content, we can align it. So we can say horizontal equals center. It jumps over there. We can say vertical equals center, and it hops into the middle. There's also the notion in there of text alignment, so we can also give this thing left, justify, center, and so on the text alignment. So let's say left on that. Now you're not going to notice any difference, but if we were to give this text block width, let's say this text block can be 284 wide, so now it's wider. And when it has width, then text alignment in this case becomes more relevant, because the text alignment can then pop it back into the center, or it can pop it out to the right, or whatever we want to do. So those alignments as well on the text, these alignments are effectively controlling the whole text block, and then this alignment is controlling the text within the text block. So that's something to be aware of as well when you're dealing with text. Okay, so at that point we'll talk a little bit more about the things that we're putting these into. So far we've been using a grid. There's 3 core panels that you can use inside of Silverlight, and some more in the Silverlight toolkit that gets installed for you. Grid is perhaps the most complex, so let's look at perhaps the simplest one in the first case. There's a very simple panel called a canvas. Generally speaking, I would avoid canvas mostly. Let's just set the background again so that you can see it. There's a red canvas. When you are laying out items inside of a canvas, like say this, let's take a button again, just drop it over here, then essentially the content takes on properties called canvas.left and canvas.top, and you are absolutely dependent upon widths and heights. So as we move this around the surface, you'll notice that what is changing is canvas.left and canvas.top, and as we size this, then widths and heights come into play. So canvas is about absolute positioning of content, and generally in Silverlight applications you want your content to be sizable. So canvas is not very useful, because if you wanted to have sizable content with this, when the size of the canvas changed, you would have to write code to visit all of the children of the canvas and resize them, and frankly no one really wants to write that sort of code in 2010. And so canvas is useful in some scenarios, but generally speaking I'd avoid it unless you have a real need for it. Where it can be useful is if you wanted to, for instance, lay out some kind of drawing and make sure that when the thing resized, you resize the whole canvas as one piece. So it can be kind of useful in places, but generally speaking I wouldn't use canvas unless you absolutely know that you have to do it. So that's kind of canvas. Another simple layout panel is a thing called a stack panel. We have a thing called a stack panel, if I could type. And of course again you can drag and drop these things from the surface over here. Stack panels, if we were just to take some buttons for instance, maybe we take radio buttons to be slightly more different. Just double click over there to insert some radio buttons. Just double click and double click and double click, and you can see that I'm inserting a whole bunch of radio buttons. Let's just zoom in on them a little bit. There they are at the top of the screen. And the stack panel essentially stacks things up according to the space it's been given, either vertically or horizontally. We can change the orientation by going to its property called orientation, and the orientation in this case is vertical. We flip it to horizontal and those things then lay themselves out that way. Clearly within the control that it's in, the stack panel then has the notion of for instance vertical alignment. We could set that to top and it's going to jump up there. We could put it back to center and it's going to pop back down there. So a stack panel is very simple in the sense of it stacks things up vertically or horizontally It's pretty much what it does. You use it often as a container or a panel within other panels. By far the most flexible panel is the grid, but before we get to that, there's another one on our toolbox over here that comes from the Silverlight toolkit called the Wrap panel. Wrap panel is pretty simple. Essentially what Wrap panel does, if we change this stack panel here to be a Wrap panel for instance, now in order to do that I'm going to just use a trick because I want to make sure that the right namespace gets added to my XAML for this. So when I drag and drop in Visual Studio, you'll notice that a special toolkit Wrap panel is inserted for me, and if I go up to the top here you'll see that that's been given an XML namespace, as we kind of talked about in our XAML video. So now that makes it easy for me to change this stack panel into a toolkit :wrap panel. And if I just go down to the bottom here I can change this in as well. And if I just get rid of the one that I dropped because that was kind of erroneous. And essentially what a Wrap panel does is based on, let me just get rid of the orientation for a moment, based on the amount of space that it's given, it wraps content. I don't know if we can easily sort of reproduce this in the designer here. We'll give it a go. Let's just go and see if we can select the whole design surface. And let's just see, as we size that, you'll notice the Wrap panel is wrapping its content according to the size it's been given. So it just wraps stuff. As if it fits, you get more space. If it doesn't fit, it goes on to the next vertical or horizontal line depending on how you've got your Wrap panel set up. So it's a fairly simple but dynamic layout for items like that. Okay, so that's the Wrap panel. And then the other one that we said we'd talk about would be the grid, which we started with. So let's just go back to putting a grid on here. Let's just go over to our designer and drag a grid over here. Where's the grid gone? And let's just make sure the grid takes all of its space. And once again, let's just set the background on this to be some color that we can see. Let's just make that red, for instance. And as you would expect, the grid is a sort of table-based layout. We can specify grid rows. I'm just going to draw some on the designer, and grid columns, as you might expect. And then we can put content into those particular grid cells. So if, for instance, we were to create, I don't know, a rectangle or something that we've been creating up until now, let's just say fill equals yellow, something like that. Then that rectangle is by default in that top cell. We can move it by checking its grid.row. These are 0 index, so this would be row 1 and that would be row 2. Again, 0 indexed on the column, so we can set column equal to 1, column equal to 2, and move it that way around. Once the rectangle is in a particular cell, let's just put it in the center for a minute, the properties that we already know about, like margin, still apply. So if we put a margin around that, then you can see the margin is still being applied there, and horizontal alignment and so on is still being applied as well, although it doesn't have a width or height, so we'd have to set one. Let's just set a height so that it fits over there. So you can see that those properties still apply even within the particular cell that the rectangle is in. Let me just get rid of some of those things. We can also have content that spans more than one grid, row or cell, so we can set a row span. So we set grid.rowSpan. Let's set that to 2, and now you can see it occupies 2 cells. And we can also set grid.columnSpan, and again it occupies 2 cells. So you get that kind of idea. Now, in the way that we drew out our rows in the designer, they're all being sort of proportionally sized, and the designer does a pixel sort of based job for me in the sense that these are not numbers that a human being would normally type in. So let me just change some of these numbers. Let's just go and say that the first column has a width, the second column I want to be twice as big, and the third column I want to be 3 times as big. So you can probably now see how that proportional sizing is working. And if I just go and do the same thing with the rows, big, and we can say twice as big and 3 times as big. And so you can see how that's working, and that gives us an opportunity to build very flexible layouts, because no matter how big this UI grows, let's just go and see if we can resize it for a second by just grabbing hold of it. You can see that as we're sizing it, those rows and columns are doing the right thing to retain their relative proportions throughout the UI, so that's working quite nicely, combined with the things we've already seen. That's not the only way you can set up rows and columns, though. You can, if you want to, we just go and hover here in the editor, set them to be auto-sized or fixed size. Fixed size is pretty obvious. If we set this top one, for instance, to be fixed size, then you'll notice that what we just did was set the height to be an absolute value of 38 pixels, and that won't change no matter how you resize the UI, so that can sometimes be quite useful. Let me just undo that change. And the other thing you can do is set these things to be auto size, which is very useful. If we auto size this top row, it will disappear, and that's because there's no content in the top row. But if we put content into that top row, like our rectangle here, just put that into row 0, and let's get rid of the column and row span here. Now you'll notice that still it seems like the row doesn't have any height, but that's because it's sizing to its content, and the content has no height. As soon as we set some content in there, the row sizes itself to fit that particular content. So however big we make that is how big that row is going to be. If we put something else into that row, say a button, and let's just go and put that again into grid.column equals 2, set the text to be set the content to be some text. There's my button over on the right hand side. If I was now to set the height on that button to be 50, then the whole row becomes a height of 50, or maybe if I make that 96, it's more obvious what's going on. And now once again, of course, the rectangle, properties like vertical alignment come into play. We can move it to the top or the bottom, because it has some space around it created by the fact that its containing row has to be big enough for all the content that's in it, and the button over there is demanding 96 pixels, and so that's kind of how that works out. We could take that away, and in that case the rectangle will size itself smaller. It's not immediately obvious, but it is possible to have content sharing grid cells. So for instance, if I was to take this button and move it into column number 1, then it sits in the same cell as the rectangle. The rectangle is very much still there. If we were to define the rectangle, if you like, after the button in our XAML, then the rectangle would be on top. I can just Control Z that back to the point where the rectangle is underneath. If we set some margin around our button, let's just say 16, you can see the rectangle is definitely there behind the button. Or if we were to set some opacity on our button, let's say 0.5, you can probably then see the rectangle through the button. They're occupying the same space on the screen, and that's absolutely fine, and sometimes that's a useful layout to be able to combine things like that. Another useful trick when it comes to layout is if we were to take something like a text block, let's set the text to be hello, and let's just put that into grid row 1 and grid column 1. And in this particular case, perhaps we'll just lay it out so that it's centered and centered the other way. In this particular case, that text is not big enough to fill that region, and it's just sizing itself. Now you could try and set a font size such that it would fill the region if that was what you wanted, but then it's quite difficult to deal with dynamic changes because you don't know what font size to set if the user resizes the UI. A useful trick to know about is that there is a control called a view box, and we can take the view box and we can wrap it around content, and what the view box does, of course we just put the view box into the wrong column. What the view box does is it looks at the available space, it looks at the size of its child and scales its child to fit the available space. So if we put a little bit more text in here, you'll see that that is still being scaled as best as possible, and you can control the stretch directions for viewbox to do that kind of work. So it's a useful layout trick to know about, that you have viewbox at your disposal. Perhaps the last thing I'll talk about here, and especially with respect to the grid, naturally of course the user can resize the user interface by just dragging around sizes of windows or browser windows, but also it's possible to easily allow the user to resize grid columns dynamically themselves, columns and rows. That's using a control called a grid splitter. So let me just make this a little bit simpler. What we'll do is just simplify this UI a second, just to illustrate this. Let's simplify all this back, and we'll just have a grid with a single, two rows in it like so, and we'll just make sure those are equally split. So we'll just give them both star sizing, which essentially is just saying that these are equally split. What we could then do is put some content in both rows. So let's take a rectangle, let's say fill equals green perhaps, and put that at the top, and let's take a rectangle, fill equals blue, and let's just put that at the bottom. So we'll just say grid row equals 1 on that, and it drops into that bottom cell. And what we could then do is use the grid splitter. If we just go over to a toolbox over here, we should be able to find a grid splitter. Here's a grid splitter. We drag the grid splitter out onto the design surface, and let's just tidy this control up a little bit. So I don't want its row span set quite like this. In fact, I'll probably just strip most of these properties off it so I can see what I'm doing. Let's just strip these properties off it. What I want the grid splitter to do is I want it to horizontally stretch itself. I want it to vertically align itself to the bottom of that particular cell that it's in, and that probably is what I want. I don't know if I can really test this in the design surface, so let's see if we can run the application and see if we can test that. Let's see if we can run this up by pressing F5 in Visual Studio and run it up under the debugger. I don't think we actually ran this application yet at this point. Often when I use grid splitters I seem to get it wrong, so let's just make sure we got something nearly right. So we've got our grid layout, hopefully just pop up on the screen. Okay, so there's our layout. You notice obviously as I resize it, those two things are taking equal proportion of the screen space. But then I have this grid splitter which actually allows me to dynamically resize. And if I've dynamically resized, then having resized, they're still taking their proportional, well, it's their new proportions that I've just dynamically decided as a user. That still works the same way as it did before. We can't only do grid splitters like this horizontally, we can do them vertically, and you can even have multiple in a grid to give quite flexible UI. So that's just another thing to know about in respect to layout. So we've seen a few panels. We saw the canvas, we saw the stack panel, we saw the grid, we saw the wrap panel. You can build your own panels as well. We talked about lots of properties like horizontal alignment, vertical alignment, margin padding, content alignment, vertical and horizontal, lots of things that affect the way that layouts are set up, and also of course just widths and heights and minimum widths and heights and how those affect things as well. A lot of the time the way you're really going to work is by dragging and dropping, so taking a button for instance and just dragging it out onto the design surface, and then it's just useful to be able to know what values you've got available for things like heights, alignments and so on, and how they affect the way things are laid out on the screen.